So as we've seen in last week's information, we have kind of this hierarchy of information. And where we were last week is we had moved from the 1/8 inch plan to the 1/4 inch plan. And the 1/4 inch plan, as we talked about, just gives us a lot more opportunity to have the information, room to put the information on the drawings, and a way of organizing the information so it's not cluttered, not difficult for the contractor or the owner or the owner's rep to read. So the idea on it is that we are moving through a process, as we talked about in the very first week, that we're taking the information at a small scale and we're going to a larger scale. Now, generally speaking, as we make these transitions, our goal is to, while the drawing is getting bigger, we have more room to provide very specific information that is important for the contractor or the subcontractors in building the work. So hopefully you'll see this pattern expand, especially next week and beyond, as we continue this process of enlarging the information and making it more available to others. So as I mentioned, this is an opportunity to take information that we may not be able to fit or be able to see very readily at an 1/8 inch and put it into information that we can understand a little better. So as we start to think about interior elevations, we're shifting our view from a plan view to a vertical view. In other words, we're looking at things that are elevated now. We're no longer looking at plan views, but elevation views. And that gives us a whole different set of perspective when it comes to the types of detail we can see in the drawing and the kinds of illustration that's available to be represented. And so if we went back in time, we would, at the 110 class, the textbook shares with us some very basic information about those orthographic projections that are represented in plans, sections, and elevations. And it might not be a bad idea if you're kind of scratching your head about this to maybe go back and look at the information, because it might bring some other information to mind that will be helpful. But basically, we're working on not exterior work, but interior elevations. And so only certain parts of the drawing are represented as, say, opposed to a section drawing. And we'll see that as we move into this information in more detail. All right, so the goals are to take that enlarged plan that we had, that 1/4 inch or even larger, and try to start describing things that are going on in that space in more detail. So we're starting to integrate plan information and elevation together, and through a process of selectively choosing the symbols and details and notations and organizing that information, then we can present that so that others can understand it more readily. So there is a transition. It goes from this plan view to a more vertical orientation. And in that process, it should be, as a designer, it should be in your mind that it is a projection of the things that are on the floor plan, that are projected vertically. And we went through this exercise in 110, and I believe we have a video to help kind of remind you of how that works. There are some ways of speeding up the process, as opposed to using a scale and trying to make all the measurements. You can actually project rather quickly from a plan up into an elevation view, and then use what you know.
Yeah, figured it out. I was just having connectivity issues.
Hello? I think we need to mute our mics here just a bit. Okay, so anyway, as a result, there's an integration of this information, and that integration is really starting to merge these multi-views together. The illustrations that are being applied are principally vertical. We do see some side views, but they are still vertical. And it is really helpful because the plan view only shows that one set of dimensions. It shows the 2 dimensions of width and depth, or width and in length, but it doesn't give us much in the way of height information. So as a result, the design information that we can provide is much more detailed and much more involved, especially as we get involved in highly complicated design arrangements. So the graded design is provided for in these drawings. As I mentioned, we can now start talking about very specific information about their heights, maybe their widths, or maybe some of the design features that are required, material references, and exact transitions between one material and another can start to be articulated in these elevations far more easily than they can be in a simple plan view. There are some other aspects to this, in that some of our regulatory requirements include providing elevation information on our drawings. If you work in hospitality and you're doing food service areas, interior elevations are required. If you're doing healthcare work for hospitals and so on, they're going to want to see every elevation that is relevant to your design. There are some basic codes that we deal with in terms of light, ventilation, sanitation requirements, and those occur in the public restrooms that we provide in our designs. Codes want to also identify when certain boundaries of fire separation are provided, and also accessibility comes into play when we start to think about reach ranges, clear spaces, and some of the height requirements and limitations associated with disabled access. From just purely a interior design standpoint, there's some spaces that we work with that just require more information. Generally speaking, that those spaces tend to be the ones that we spend more time on to draw them and understand them and represent them properly. And they have, I'll say, probably more working parts. Now, as we look at, say, break rooms, we have banks of cabinets, we have the interface of appliances, and we have requirements for both electrical and plumbing. So all these pieces start to merge, not just from the plan view, but from these elevations. And of course, as you get into these other types of spaces where specialty equipment is required, like in audiovisual applications or maybe a boardroom of sorts, then you're going to want elevated finishes at different locations. And it's just much easier using an interior elevation for that, as it would be, say, in a restaurant or in a hotel environment. So as a result, these areas, and as I mentioned, these functional applications do require us to articulate the design in elevation. And I think we've talked about these in a previous slide. We just want to make sure that the information's available. If it's not available and on the documents, you may find that the plan check review personnel will request it. And, just an aside here for a minute, as I'm as I'm planning for a project, I'm thinking about all these things ahead of time. I'm thinking not only about how the plan view works and the enlarged plans, but I'm also thinking how they relate to the interior elevations. And we'll talk a bit more about that, especially in the assignment a bit later. But I think it's important to understand that the planning part of this requires a little bit of thought. How many elevations and how much space they're going to consume on a sheet and how they're grouped together is kind of important. So we want plans generally to go with elevations when we can put them together and where the sheet space provides. That means that the person who's viewing the information can look at the plan and then look at the elevations at the same scale immediately adjacent on the sheet and have a more easy time in understanding all the parts and pieces. So other specialty requirements include elements of cabinetry. And we're going to talk a lot more about cabinetry next week. But this week, we're going to actually have an opportunity to kind of dip our toe in that water. We do have one detail to do this week, and that's in cabinetry. And I think it's helpful to understand that in the development of your own design thinking, we'll look at a plan and that'll help us understand that, what the configuration is within the space. And then we look to the elevation to start telling us, what is the cabinetry made of? What is it? How is it broken up? How many doors are on it? How many shelves or drawers are provided? And this then gives you, I'll say, a mental checklist or a lead in on what kind of detail information you're going to need to provide later in the documents. So this is all developmental. I will say that many or most designers do not design the cabinetry before they've gone through the process of laying it out on an 1/8" plan where it needs to go in what rooms, and done it on an enlarged plan so they can see the interaction of all the different appliances and built elements around it. But once they get to the elevation, they start to think about, what kind of door pulls am I going to use? What kind of drawer hardware am I going to use? What are the detail of the front of the cabinet's going to look like? And this often occurs during this time because we can see it in detail and we can make detailed decisions about the cabinetry design. And more will be discussed next week when we look at this topic in more detail. So the content of this information generally involves, that transition between what is in the designer's mind and what's required to actually build it. As mentioned, when we go to this information, our scale enlarges. And from the scale that we're working on today, we will do even larger scale drawings moving into next week. So in one sense, it actually is easier to draw. There's a lot of detail, a lot of parts and pieces, but it's easier to understand as opposed to a very small drawing. And the idea is that we can start to look at the construction requirements from multiple vantage points, not just what's happening in plan view, but what's happening above the elevated wall, what might be happening below in terms of requirements for power, requirements for plumbing, and fixturization. So all those things are pretty important, especially as we're moving into more specific design information. So these elevations generally include this list that's provided here. And so we need graphic representation for all these types of materials and designs. And so this is an opportunity to focus your attention on the finished design and really start to understand where these, how these pieces work together to complete your design. So some of this includes even referencing information that has to do with specific material symbols. We want to be very careful about where the limits or where those boundaries occur. And we want to be very clear about dimensioning thresholds that are important for the contractor to know. There's no way that they're going to guess properly, and it can be very frustrating for those in the field if this information isn't properly provided. So some of the things that we as designers are concerned about then are, going back to some of the things we've talked about in the earlier part of the semester. How do the existing conditions, what are the wall conditions that are there provided? What are we going to find on the site that might be an obstacle to us fulfilling the design features that we want to provide? And so the coordination of those existing conditions with the enlarged plan drawings is a pretty important piece, especially as we go forward into the interior elevations. So having the correct information is important. We want to make sure that what we're drawing at this stage is pretty thoughtfully drawn to scale. Even though we don't want the contractor to actually put a scale on the drawing, we should feel confident that the graphic representation that we're providing is reliable. I can tell you that from many long meetings in a construction trailer with construction professionals, if the information isn't there, it's not only uncomfortable, it's a little bit embarrassing because, their people are there and they're getting paid an hourly wage. And if your information doesn't provide that for them, then, they're looking to you to be a stronger design professional and provide them the information that is needed for your drawings to be successful. So, so the other things that are important then become, the very clear and obvious placement of features. And that might include things like the placement of the sink, placement of appliances, of fittings that go with plumbing, electrical that services, things like microwaves or copy machines or any variety of elements that have to do with the functions and the aesthetic designs that you're trying to work on. So those dimensions, as mentioned, become pretty important also. So the correct referencing is important. Hopefully you'll remember the symbols that we used in that. That is a kind of inverted square on a 45-degree with a circle in the center. You can find that in the toolbox that we're providing you with, and you can see how that works. Last week, I think we gave you some of that information, and it's intended to provide the symbol for identifying elevations inside the building. We don't rely on north, south, east, and west on an interior elevation because it gets kind of backwards. The north wall is actually facing south and people start getting a little confused with, is it a north elevation or is it a south elevation? So as a result, we use those industry standard symbols, and we'll see those a bit later here. The detail references become important because we're going to lead the viewer or the person reading these drawings to even more detailed information elsewhere, so that detail symbol becomes important. How we illustrate a section cut at these walls, especially with cabinetry, is likewise important um, folks to understand what's going on with the cabinetry. So one of the things that are associated, another element that is associated with these risks is, as we've talked about in the past, is, how does our design work with the existing condition, especially as relates to substrates? Is the material that we are applying to the existing wall or to even the new wall appropriate for the type of finish we're putting on there? So does the wall is the wall waterproofed? Is the water sized? Is the water, is the wall braced to be able to accommodate the different features that we're providing? The design characteristics are important because obviously the client has put their trust in us as design professionals to provide, an enhanced design solution. And then there's a follow-up that comes at the backside, and that is, how well are the materials maintained? And so we're thinking about those even as we're elevating these walls in cabinets so that we understand, how the user is going to use them and what their expectations are, especially as regards to its longevity and its functionality over time. Of course, there are some administrative risks. Those risks have to do a lot with project budgets, product availability, which is something I just uh, had an issue with today. Um, I was contacted, actually one of our designers was contacted. We had done a corporate project that is under construction in the early stages, and the product rep called and said that the mothership, the corporate headquarters, had taken the president's words um, as being important, and they're moving all their production out of China. This is a big tile operation, and their comment was, so the product that you specified is now changed. So we had to send out a memo to everyone saying the product references that we've provided are no longer available, and here's the substitution that is recommended. We've reviewed it and all that, but they're in the middle of constructing. So those types of things create a little bit of a difficult place for us sometimes. And of course, we're always worried about errors and omissions claims. Those types of situations, uh, knock on wood, we don't have to deal with too much. I knock on wood because I've dodged the bullet these many years, but I will say that most of it is because I've put in the time to make sure the documents are correct. We do have insurance, and we're required to carry the insurance by our clients, but thankfully there have been no requirements for claims on that. By the way, that insurance is, if Trish hasn't mentioned it in her class, is rather expensive. And if there is a claim, the very first thing they do after they pay the claim is drop you. And it's very hard to get another insurance company to pick you up afterwards. So it's a very guarded situation.